Hey folks, welcome back to Candace Boxing Channel. Hope everybody's doing well. I realised that this is the 200th video that I'm recording. And when I realised I was going to record the 200th video, I figured I should do something a little special. Now the obvious choice would be to talk about one of my favourite fighters from all time. But I thought, no, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to talk about a fighter who I hated as a child, but who I came to admire and who is now recognised as one of the top 10 British heavyweights of all time. And that's none other than Joe Bugner. Now, Joe Bugner was born Josef Kroil Bugner on March the 13th, 1950 in Hungary. And like I say, when I was a child, I hated him because he defeated my hero, Henry Cooper. So he has a professional career that's distinguished by bouts against some of the 1970s top heavyweights, which, of course, as we know, means that some of the very best heavyweights ever. And if you look at a scan of his box rec, you'll see he fought such opponents as Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, Ron Lyle, Jimmy Ellis, Manuel Ramos, Chuck Wepner, Ernie Shavers, Henry Cooper, Brian London, Mac Foster, Rudy Lubers, Eduardo Corletti, and Jürgen Blin. And of course, later on in his career, he fought lots of other people who went on to, have great careers. He even fought Frank Bruno, James Bone Crusher Smith, James Tillis. Like, he's got a really interesting record. His box rec is actually 69 wins, 13 losses, and 1 draw. He's 6'4" and 82-inch reach. His weight went up as he got older. When he beat Henry Cooper, he weighed in at 212. When he fought Muhammad Ali, he weighed 230. And when he fought Bruno, he was 256. So he was a good-sized heavyweight, almost a perfect heavyweight build, that sort of 6'3", 6'4", and probably at his absolute prime was probably 225, 230. Anyhow, his story is an inspirational one. He was renowned for his resilience and skill in the ring. And that journey that he went on from leaving Soviet aggression in Hungary to emigrating to Britain is one that's, compelling and frankly inspiring. So let's have a look at Joe Bugner's overall career, both in the ring and after. And like everybody that we talk about who's historically a boxer, I recommend people read up about him. There's actually a really good book. Joe Bugner's autobiography is called Joe Bugner, My Story. And it offers a lot of personal insights and anecdotes as well. So that's sort of a book that you should sort of, add to your boxing library if you're interested in Joe Bugner. And I think there's some good documentaries available on YouTube as well. So this is just the view from 20,000 feet, right? So in 1956, following the Soviet invasion of Hungary, the Bugner family fled their homeland seeking refuge in the United Kingdom. They settled in St. Ives, Cambridgeshire, where young Joe adapted well to his new environment, and he became a real sporting star in school. And before boxing, he excelled in the discus throw, and he won the 1964 National Junior Championships as a discus thrower. He transitioned to boxing, and that was a very swift and successful transition. And he boxed, of course, as the Fen Tiger. If you come from that part of the UK and you take up boxing, you're probably going to get the nickname the Fen Tiger at some point in your career. He only had 16 amateur fights and he won 13 of them before turning professional at the age of 17. His natural talent, combined with a strong work ethic, set the stage for that notable professional career. So he turned pro in 1967. And by 1970, he was emerging internationally as a really strong prospect. And he was world rated by the end of 1970. He'd won 9 consecutive bouts, including victories over Chuck Wepner, Manuel Ramos, Johnny Prescott, Brian London, Eduardo Coletti, Charlie Polite, and George Johnson. And he was now positioned to challenge the aging but much loved Henry Cooper. And I've done a video on Henry Cooper that spends quite a bit of time talking about Bugner, obviously. And if you haven't seen that video on Henry Cooper, I'll put a link in at the end of this video. I really recommend you take a look because, of course, Henry Cooper is beloved by many generations of British fans. I loved Henry Cooper. My dad loved Henry Cooper. You know, you've probably loved Henry Cooper. Who didn't, right? So anyhow, Henry Cooper was aging. I think Henry Cooper was like 37. And of course, Cooper's renowned for having dropped a young Muhammad Ali, who was then in their first fight called Cassius Clay. But Henry Cooper, of course, had 3 Lonsdale belts outright. Henry Cooper had dominated the British, Commonwealth and European scene for at least a decade, probably a bit longer, more like 12 years, I think. Anyways, the challenge was to be for Cooper's British, Commonwealth and European titles. But Bugner was too young to challenge for the Commonwealth title, because in those days, you had to be 21 years old. And so they postponed the bout between Bugner and Cooper until the following year. So while waiting to come of age, 21, he defeated another couple of opponents just weeks before he fought Cooper. And Bugner met the veteran Cooper in March of 71. And Bugner did win by the absolute slimmest of margins. Harry Gibbs was the only official. Harry Gibbs was the referee. And Harry Gibbs awarded Bugner the title, the victory, and all the titles, the British Commonwealth, and European, by 1/4 of a point. It was you cannot get, or you could not get in those days, a slimmer victory. Now, the British sporting public if you look on the internet, they'll say that the British sporting public was deeply divided. Actually, the British sporting public wasn't really deeply divided. The British sporting public was absolutely freaking outraged. In my own lived experience, most felt that Cooper deserved the victory. Not just because he was Henry Cooper and he was loved and all that, but because he was the aggressor. Bugner was sort of he fought very effectively off the back foot and he had a very good jab. And it's arguable. Like if you look at the fight today, it is arguable, right? But at the time, Bugner was hated. And, you know, the bout is still regarded, I think, today as one of the most controversial in British boxing history. And as I said in my video about Henry Cooper, I think Bugner's win over Cooper was probably the worst thing that could have happened to Joe Bugner. And that's not a misspeak. The worst thing that could have happened to Joe Bugner. It's obviously a very bad thing that happened to Henry Cooper. He lost all his titles on 1/4 point. He retired. He was always going to retire, but he retired. And you know, there was bad feeling between him and Harry Gibbs for many, 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 many years. It was a lawsuit, and it was just a terrible decision in many respects. But the person who I think really suffered was Joe Bugner. Because Joe Bugner had gone from being this darling prince of British boxing, like he was a very good-looking guy, he had curly blonde hair, blue eyes, big, tall, strapping-looking fellow. He went from that to being this Hungarian. It was almost like he was immediately no longer a Brit. He was this frickin' Hungarian who came in and stole our Enry's titles. And I don't think the British public ever forgave him. And it wasn't his fault. He's just 21 years old. And he's fighting the 37-year-old Henry Cooper, who was a legend. And he arguably won. It was a real close decision. Had Harry Gibbs given it to Henry Cooper would have sailed off into the sunset. He would have anointed Joe Bugner as his, successor, heir apparent, whatever. And Joe Bugner would have then sort of taken on that mantle. And Joe Bugner's career, I think, would have been very, very different. Maybe not necessarily more successful, but he would have been adored by the British public. As it was, to be honest, he was hated. He was never forgiven for beating Henry Cooper. And like I say, my lived experience, I remember as an 11-year-old kid, around my dad and all his mates, and even my mom, and people were opposed to Joe Bugner for beating Henry Cooper, like he'd done something wrong. It was an interesting time. If you read about it, if you weren't alive and you read about it, you won't really appreciate it. Some newspapers actually did say that Bugner had won. I think the Times said that Bugner had won. The Times wasn't a paper that sold particularly well in the working class town in which I grew up in. So anyhow, I didn't know that the Times had said Bugner had won until many years later, because it certainly wasn't known in my town, my community. Everybody thought that Bugner had stolen the title off Cooper. Nevertheless, Bugner was now the British Commonwealth and European champion. And he was ranked in the top 10, and he would remain in the top 10 for most of the 1970s. He retained his European title by beating Jürgen Blin, but in 1971, so later in the same year, he lost a decision to underdog Jack Bodell. Now, Jack Bodell was one of Henry Cooper's opponents. Bodell and Cooper and Erskine, they all used to battle it out, right? Jack Bodell actually beat Joe Bugner, which was a big surprise. But remember, Joe Bugner was still very inexperienced at that time, right? Like I say, he was 21 years old. Just, a kid against a much, much more experienced opponent. Maybe if you look, say, at Moses Itoma today and you put Moses in with some of maybe the top 5, he might be able to win, but he might well simply not have enough experience, to win against a more cagey, experienced opponent. Bugner, like I say, fought all the top names in the 1970s, and he went the distance with Muhammad Ali twice. He went the distance with him in 1973 and 1975. And Ali spoke very favourably of Joe Bugner, who I think on one of their fights was actually rated number 4 in the world. He lost unanimous decisions on both occasions, and they were not super exciting fights. But remember, this is, if not exactly peak Ali, this is still, real darn good Ali, right? 73 is before the Rumble in the Jungle, right? 75 is just after Rumble in the Jungle. So we're not talking of old man Ali of 79 and 80. We're still talking of Ali who had lots in the tank. And so to go twice with Ali, that version of Ali, was no small feat whatsoever. And he was able to, I think Bugner was respected for what he did. Though I remember reading that, people didn't think that he'd done enough. He hadn't tried hard enough. And again, there was that sense that, people were reluctant to get behind Bugner. And I often think if only he'd lost to Cooper, then people would have, you'd have had 50 million people supporting him. Bugner also faced Joe Frazier in 1973. Again, losing by unanimous decision. Again, going the distance with Joe Frazier is no small feat. Lots of people didn't get to hear the 15th round, right? Remember, these are 15-round fights, not 12-round fights. And that performance solidified his reputation as a durable and skilled heavyweight. And now I'm going to talk about one of my favorite Bugner fights. It's actually a fight of not great consequence, but hey, if you're still watching, I hope you are, this is a fun fight to talk about. So early in 1976, Bugner announced that he was retiring from boxing. He said he no longer felt motivated to fight professionally. However, within a few months, he returned to the ring because he expressed absolute disgust at former paratrooper Richard Dunn, who had the notable distinction of being the very last person that Muhammad Ali knocked out. Ali flattened Richard Dunn, knocking him to the canvas multiple times in their fight, which I think was held in Germany, I think. Don't quote me on that. But anyways, Richard Dunn went in against Muhammad Ali. It was Ali's last knockout. Ali knocked him down multiple times. Richard Dunn was game, but, not game enough, right? So anyhow, Joe Bugner was pissed off about this and said that he didn't think that Richard Dunn had tried his best, kind of thing. Well, Richard Dunn and his wife, I think at the time, they were all over Bugner. They called him a sugar plum fairy. And I remember that because it was just one of those things that stuck in my head. Well, on October the 12th, 1976, Dunn had fought Ali in May of 76. So in October of 76, Joe Bugner absolutely blasted out Richard Dunn in the first round to reclaim the British Commonwealth and European championships. Now, many people at the time said, and I was, now a much more sort of, compos mentis kind of teenager, I would agree that was the first time that Bugner showed real anger. Like he was pissed with Richard Dunn. And many people say that if he'd fought like that earlier in his career, he could have gone further, because Bugner was absolutely on point. I'm done with you. And Richard Dunn had been very unsportsmanlike in his comments and like early version trash talking, right? And Richard Dunn had a lot of support from the British people, even though Richard Dunn was, truly speaking, nowhere near the quality of fighter that Joe Bugner was. And Joe Bugner just battered him. 1 round KO. It's a great fight. I loved it. I remember, being actually, I remember supporting Bugner at that time. So between 71 and 76, I'd sort of become a Bugner fan, I guess. So anyways, Joe Bugner later on moved to Australia. He adopted the nickname Aussie Joe, and he beat fighters like Greg Page, David Bay, Anders Eklund, and James Tillis before retiring again after a TKO loss to Frank Bruno in 1987. So that's a long career, right? You start off with Henry Cooper and you sort of, at the other end of the scale with Frank Bruno. He made a final comeback in the 1990s. He won the Australian heavyweight title in 1995 and the World Boxing Federation WBF heavyweight championship in 1998 at the age of 48 against James Bone Crusher Smith. Now this makes him the oldest man to hold a heavyweight championship belt, though it's a minor belt. It's not sort of super well recognized. So, strictly speaking, George Foreman's 1994 win, when George Foreman was 45, makes George Foreman the oldest heavyweight champion in the world. But we must give some recognition to Joe Bugner, who at 48 beat Bone Crusher Smith. So anyhow, he retired for the very last time in 1999. And like I say, his final record is 69-13-1. He was often criticized, like I say, for lacking natural aggression in the ring. But some people have argued that Bugner's heart was never super into boxing because an early opponent, Ulrich Regis, died from brain injury after being outpointed by Bugner at London's Shoreditch Town Hall. And people said that after that, Bugner never punched his full weight again, with possible exception of the Richard Dunn fight. After retiring from boxing, Bugner ventured into acting. He appeared in Street Fighter with Jean-Claude Van Damme, and he became loved in Australia as Aussie Joe. You can see interviews of him back in the 90s and early 2000s when he'd really found happiness and his third country had taken Aussie Joe to their heart. So big up Aussie boxing fans for doing that. In more recent years, Bugner's faced significant health challenges. He's had bouts of skin cancer. And if you look at the more recent reports, people say that Joe Bugner is now suffering from the advanced stages of Alzheimer's or dementia. I don't know if I've read a proper diagnosis, but as is the case with many retired fighters, they suffer from the injuries that the blows they incurred during their boxing career. So apparently he resides in a care home in Brisbane, Australia, and sadly, so I've read, he no longer really remembers his illustrious boxing career, very similar to George Chuvalo, who I've also done a video on. So like I say, that's Joe Bugner. I believe very firmly he's one of Britain's top 10 heavyweight boxers. I think he's been chronically underrated by British fans, recognized by Australian fans. He was recognized by Muhammad Ali as being a very tough opponent. I think it's very sad that his moment of victory against Henry Cooper was held against him. And I would hope that as we have new generations of fans, of course, many of the people watching this won't have been alive in 1971, that people will remember Joe Bugner for what he was and, accord him his proper place in boxing history. Was he an all-time great? No. Does he make my top 10, my lifetime? No. Is he one of the top British heavyweights of my lifetime? Absolutely, unequivocally, yes. He fought all the top people around. And if you compare his resume to the resume of top British fighters today, I think you will appreciate that he fought all comers. He won some and he lost some. Those he lost, he went the distance with. No small feat, and he should be remembered and respected for the achievements he made during his long career. So there we go. My 200th video is in the bag. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching all my videos. Thank you for liking the channel, subscribing to the channel. There's 756 of us now. That's simply awesome. And most importantly, have a fabulous day. And remember to keep these boxers from yesteryear firmly in your memory banks. And if you're talking to people in your pub or sports bar, occasionally, and you're talking about boxing, obviously, mention some of these great fighters from the past. And, let's keep all these great fighters who gave so much to the sport fresh in our memories and pass the word on to future boxing fans about these great fighters. Thank you very much for watching. Cheers. Bye-bye.